Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, and welcome to another CTO Insights podcast. On this show, we're doing something a little bit different with our first ever remote guest. So bear with us. If I manage to break the technology, I'll apologise in advance. But as you know, we do these conversations in a slightly longer form than our Tech Takeaways podcast, and we cover in a little bit more depth some of the hot topics as leaders, IT leaders, as CXOs inside of organizations that we're looking to address. And one of the topics that we wanted to cover, and we've got a great guest to help us to do that today, one of the topics we wanted to cover was to kind of look at the human side of cybersecurity, some of the threats that people have within our organizations, some of the new techniques that they've been targeted with, and some of the things as leaders in IT organizations that we can do about that. So to help me chat through that today, I'm joined by Kiri Addison. Hi, Kiri. How are you doing?
Hi, Paul. Yeah, good, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you join us. So, well, before we jump into our topic, why don't you give us a little bit about background, who you are, and what it is you do?
Sure. So, I'm the product manager for detection and efficacy at Mimecast. So Mimecast is a cybersecurity company, communication, collaboration, security, traditionally very much focused on email, but moving into other forms of collaboration, like SharePoint, Teams, for example, with a big focus on human risk as well. So in my role, I'm working very closely with our threat researchers, our engineers, our data scientists to kind of make sure that we're staying on top of the latest attacks and trends.
So, it's an interesting job title, detection efficacy. I kind of like that as a job title because I think that's actually a core part of kind of the cybersecurity landscape, isn't it? We need to be able to find threats and we need to be effective at doing them. So, good job title. So, no pressure. So, just to make sure all that works. We wanted to kind of focus a little bit. A really interesting thing, actually, you said in your introduction, kind of about Mimecast background of looking at email security, but now spreading that into other communications channels. And I think that plays really interestingly into kind of the topic for today, the way that people are part of our cybersecurity landscape. So, I kind of gave that as a bit of an introduction, but what's your view on kind of the human-centric nature of cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's kind of really interesting. I'm sure we've all heard the statistics around, basically all kind of breaches involve some form of human error or trying to trick a human into making a mistake before an action. We do as well thinking about email. Apparently, around 90% of attacks start with email. So there's a good intersection, in that space there. But then also thinking about how things have changed over the last few years, the COVID pandemic, people from working from home, and the kind of changing tools that people are using, kind of collaboration tools like Slack, Teams. It's changed the landscape a little bit, but fundamentally it's still kind of messages, files being delivered or URLs being clicked.
Yeah, and I think that's in kind of interesting description as well. To talk about the way that the changing landscape that we operate in, how that landscape has kind of changed the way that that we see that because of the way we operate, it's began to change the way that we see threats. So I suppose from your kind of background, working for a cybersecurity vendor and working in that space, what's some of the evolution that you've seen in the way that actually maybe if we step back slightly, what's the bit that the way people have been targeted and how have you seen that evolve?
So I guess kind of recently what we've seen is this kind of phishing explosion, QR phishing. So these are the weaponized QR codes. So you get an email with QR code in. The idea is that you'll take your phone out, scan the QR code, and on the end of that, the attacker would put it's probably like a phishing credential harvesting page, could be a piece of malware. And that's something that we have seen just completely take off over the last few months towards the end of the last year. And what's interesting is that we've talked about that in security for a long time as, something that could be abused, but we didn't really see it happening. And I think it's kind of happened again. It's like as we're used to using QR codes generally for things, attackers have been able to exploit that.
Yeah, and I think, QR codes is interesting. It kind of ties together a couple of interesting things, doesn't it? One is this idea of catching people like kind of unsuspectingly. So, a QR code's not necessarily, people are getting increasingly used to seeing a link in an email and thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't click that. And we've got technology that's good at spotting kind of fake URLs and being able to apply some protection. But actually that idea with QR codes, I think part of that is that people don't necessarily even think about that as a threat. But I think the other thing that it speaks to as well is this kind of, targeting of mobile users. You're unlikely to be whipping your laptop out to scan a QR code. I mean, you might do, but you'd look a bit weird. But what's far more likely is you're going to see people taking out mobile phones. They're going to, double click, access the camera, scan a QR code, and then really not think about it. Is that? I mean, is that accurate? Is that something that we are seeing? This kind of shift towards mobile as a particular attack vector as well?
Yeah, I think, like in general, communication channel switch are things that we see in emails. So trying to move people onto less secure means of communication, particularly with things like your payloadless being seen as a email compromise attacks. The attacker might start off with, a few lines in an email that might be impersonating the CEO and just say, "Oh, can you help me with an urgent task quickly?" So it's kind of using social engineering techniques to put pressure on the victim. But they're not kind of saying, what their ultimate goal is in email, where it's more likely to be picked up. They'll say, "Oh, can you give me your phone number?" So that, again, they're trying to move someone onto a less secure channel.
Yeah, and again, that kind of, social engineering targeting of people, I think I would think probably most people listening to this, are probably aware of this, but maybe it's always worth re-emphasizing that human-led attack is probably still the primary route, and actually phishing is probably still the primary routes that cyber attackers are taking. But I mean, do you think? I mean, we've talked about a couple of things here, and we've talked about kind of targeting people and also this kind of mobile threat. Do you think organizations, just in your experience, how aware are organizations of these kind of shifting threats? How is there a situation perhaps where we're talking with organizations who don't maybe appreciate the mobile threat, for example?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think it really varies depending on the organization and how mature they are, because you'll have some much say, "What are you doing about this, new threat that I've seen?" And that's good. It's, they're obviously aware of it. They're obviously thinking about it. But yeah, we're unsure for some, there's a gap in our defense that we're not considering. But particularly if you think around, more traditional methods of awareness training, that's obviously, a way to combat this is by educating your end users. Like, this is something that's happening. Be aware. It's very similar to risks that you're probably familiar with, like clicking on links. But, if you're not doing that kind of regular program updating with users, then they're not going to be aware of what's going on currently.
And actually, it's kind of another one of my favorite hobby horses. I think is actually this idea of awareness training. Have you seen that space evolve? Because I think one of my views of it has been that sometimes it can be a space that's a little bit jaded. So people have kind of got used to this idea of we send them off to a course that either is dull or it's a little bit wacky, or people are using cartoons, or but actually over time it's almost become a thing that people have looked at and thought, it's just something I've got to check my way through to get the tick in the box. And I think sometimes I feel organizations fall into two categories with this kind of thing. Actually, one is they either fully get security awareness training and invest in it and continue to invest in it, or they just don't understand the value of it and are not for turning. I mean, have you seen that as a space that's evolving in a way that we look to educate users of threats, just to kind of make it more interactive, more realistic, and more? I mean, you talked about efficacy as part of your job title, more effective in a way that we go about delivering it.
Yeah, definitely. And at Mimecast, we've actually just acquired a really interesting company that's all about human risk, and they brought with them some very interesting research. There are a couple of points there. So the first point is that around 8% of the users are responsible for 80% of the breaches. So, if you focus on those high risk users, then you can really bring down, the impact or the risk there. The other interesting part was that, they found that pretty much no matter how much training, traditional kind of awareness training give people, they're always going to be this kind of group, your risky kind of 4% roughly that just click on anything. They don't listen. So yeah, you really do need to think of different approaches, different ways to deal with them, to engage them, different responses you can have to them, adaptive kind of policies based on their risk level. But to do that, you need to understand who those users are. So that comes down to getting the right sources of data to find that out. So we're in quite an interesting position where we have email data, so we can see who's being targeted by what. We can see, are they clicking on links, from real links that we're blocking, also kind of awareness training campaigns, how engaged they are with those campaigns. And then we can kind of integrate other sources of data as well. So that's really important. What's going on the endpoint, what we're seeing from an identity point of view as well. So I think it's evolving to be more kind of data-driven and risk-focused rather than just, this breaking a cycle and program of we'll just churn out some training videos and see what happens.
Yeah, I think churning out training videos and see what happens is a great phrase. Yeah. But I think that is part of a problem with that kind of space. Actually, is that's almost how it's developed. And I love the idea that you with all of your insight and research still defaults to the idea that clickers are clickers and clickers will just click. I think it doesn't matter how much research you do, it always boils down to there's always going to be somebody going to click on something. But I think it was quite interesting what you talked about there, and kind of. This mirrors some of the research I've done recently into kind of phishing prevention solutions, and actually the importance of that, almost that feedback loop. So, that idea of taking additional telemetry to understand where not only how effective training is and where the risk is, but also using that with the risk vectors that you're pulling together as well to just try and marry those two things together. Is that how you see the space going when it comes to better education? In that, using kind of telemetry we get externally to identify threat, and then maybe to be able to target quite bespoke training at those most at risk.
Yeah, definitely. So we could say, okay, this group of people, this person, maybe this department, they typically receive, phishing, they receive malware, whatever. So this is the most appropriate training content to send to that person. We can also see people's levels of engagement. Maybe they are, they really enjoy certain types of training content. They're getting all the questions right. So you can tailor it, based on that. Yeah. And I suppose it depends on, organization, how you feel about it. Do you want to punish people or reward people? I guess you can make that decision based on the data you have.
Yeah, but I think that's a really exciting development, actually, from somebody like Mimecast as well, because I think that's, I say, kind of mirrors some of the things that I've been looking at in that space. And not to pat me on the back saying, aren't I clever? But aren't I? But actually looking at, seeing vendors starting to kind of look at how can we use both this information that we get from our users and their training, so we already know potentially who's at risk, but also who's effective in identifying potential risk. I think that's a useful piece of telemetry. But tying that to kind of real world threat data is a really interesting development, I think. And I think it would be remiss of us, and heck, we wouldn't even be a tech podcast if we didn't talk about kind of the evolving issues that AI creates in this space. So, what are you seeing in terms of the way AI is being used to target people more effectively?
Yeah, we definitely have to mention that, I guess. It's a really interesting one because, there's kind of I think a spectrum of, I ask maybe more seasoned kind of malware analysts about what they think is going to happen with AI, and they're like, no, we don't need it. We can code. Then you've got the more marketing-minded people, it's going to be the end of the world, the end of everything. So I think it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And, that's what our threat research is kind of telling me as well. There's obviously attackers that are using it. We see them kind of asking each other for help, developing phishing emails, coming up with their own kind of variants, and it's clearly going to automate a lot of their tasks, make their life easier. But we're not seeing it completely revolutionize the threat landscape from our perspective yet. I think there's a lot that, could be done in this space, and it's definitely something that, we need to have an eye on and monitor. But it was quite interesting. So I was at InfoSec a few weeks ago now, did a workshop there, and I was asking people, have you actually seen any AI kind of based threats? The response was generally well, we don't know. We don't know what they'd look like if we saw them. There was one person who said, yes, I know, I see the phishing emails and I can tell the difference because I look at them every day. I thought it was quite interesting that was the general response. We don't know.
Yeah, and actually it is a really interesting point, isn't it? Because I think actually that idea of I wouldn't know it if I saw it is exactly the risk that we're looking at. Is that actually the way, and I think we're probably all seeing it, whether you recognize it or you don't. But I think that, that big challenge is, that kind of, cyber attacks, phishing-based attacks particularly, were often easy to spot, both actually from a human perspective, but also from a technology perspective, because you could spot things like, you could look for poor grammar, you could look for malicious links within code, you could look for them coming from incorrect domains. But I think one of the things that we're seeing, and actually I'll kind of pinch my Tech Takeaways co-host, Jason Fitzgerald's kind of view on this, in that actually what we're seeing kind of technology deployed inside of organizations. So almost that initial attack being, the idea of let me deploy something in your organization, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit there and use reconnaissance to try and craft much better, much more targeted attacks. And where that reconnaissance time used to take, 30, 40 days, now you're seeing that reconnaissance time maybe take 5, 6, 7 days, because actually they're able to feed so much more of that into AI tools and use those AI tools as a way to more quickly sift through the information that they've got. I mean, is that something that you're seeing as well, that, people have been able to use these tools to not only be more accurate, but be more accurate more quickly?
Yeah, I think that's, kind of really interesting. So I know CrowdStrike have reported a few instances where they've actually seen attackers who have already gained access and trying to move laterally, kind of spin up, open the browser and access the Gen AI app and ask for help. They've seen scripts that they think have come from a particular LLM because they match a certain format. So I think it is being used. There's also, I think there's a really interesting research paper around using LLM agents for website hacking. So this is where you would take, in that case, they used GPT-4. They found that to be the most successful. You then give it access to certain tools. So it's like a headless browser. So they have programmatic access to the website, terminal access, and a set of documents as well, which are all kind of open source documents about website hacking exploitation. And that's kind of a typical, like a pretty standard way to improve your accuracy of your LLM outputs, is to just kind of give them access to documents to kind of focus them here. So using that, they were able to instruct the LLM agent to go off and hack this website, and basically the output was a list of vulnerabilities. And the LLM was able to use these tools. It would come up with a plan as to how it was going to achieve its target, or if you use the tools, take the output, do something with that, come up with the next step in the plan, and put together some quite complicated steps there. So I think that's something that's really powerful. And if you imagine that in the context of the kill chain, you could go from your reconnaissance gathering all the way to action on objectives, potentially. Like that's quite, it would take a lot probably to do that. But I think with perhaps going in that direction, and like you say, even just the ability to automate a lot of the steps in the kill chain, and it's just be very useful for it.
I'm sure. Yeah, and I think it's like with all tools, isn't it? I think you find that kind of where we're seeing AI being a useful tool inside of an organization from a kind of a productivity point of view, an efficiency point of view. It's also the same for cyber attackers. They are seeing this as it's increases my productivity, increases my efficiency by being able to use these tools. But I think I think when you're looking at this space, if I'm a C-suite executive in an organization, actually looking at how do I protect my people in this modern threat, I think one of the things, or modern threat landscape, I think one of the things I would definitely be looking for is how are the tools that I'm evaluating being effective in using AI themselves to defend against the AI threat. And I know recently I saw some interesting ideas around using AI within kind of a defensive posture to look at threats as they come in, then use generative AI to recreate versions of that so that they could better train themselves for the kind of things to look for, And I think those kind of steps are really interesting. But I mean, from your point of view, on the vendor side, how are you seeing how are you seeing kind of the defensive technologies start to evolve? What are some of the things that, if you're evaluating this space, you're a C-suite, you're an IT leader, what are some of the things you think people should be looking for now? And what are some of the developments you're seeing?
So Yeah, we're finding large language models to be very useful from a defensive perspective. Particularly, you thought about the problem of BC. I think the FBI reported last year losses at $2.9 million to BC, which is increased a few hundred million from last year. So it's a big problem. And that's all, payloadless attacks. It's all about understanding language. And typically traditional solutions have found that very difficult because, there are so many different ways you could essentially ask the same thing of someone. How many different ways can you think of to ask for a wire transfer? It's really hard to detect that just using 2 words or patterns, regex. But, stick those emails through a large language model that's been trained to look for specific BEC topics, and it's really, really effective. It doesn't really matter the language that you use because it's the context that it's looking for. So that has been, a really great improvement we've seen. And the interesting thing is, we've tried it with AI-generated phishing emails as well. And again, it doesn't matter because essentially it's still trying to ask the same thing of the victim. So whether it's human-generated, AI-generated, it can still detect these. And it's probably typically easier, I'd say, for it to detect the AI-generated ones because they tend to be longer and have they repeat the same kind of points in context. So potentially making it easier for us.
That's an interesting point as well, isn't it? Is that, and maybe we are going to need kind of machines to be able to do this quickly and at scale, but actually that machines are probably better at spotting the telltale signs of other machines than we are. So I think that's quite an interesting shift. So, I suppose one of the things that I think is always interesting in this space, you're working at a vendor, you're speaking with customers. I'm sure you're kind of presenting a lot to customers as well. What's some of the things then in terms of what a CXO, should know today? So if they're looking at the kind of threat landscape as far as their people are concerned, what are some of the things that they should be considering? And and because this isn't just a technology problem, of course, this is a business problem, this is a human problem. What are some of the tips that you're giving people in terms of how they can make sure, one, that they stay ahead of the threat, and what they should be considering as they go forward in terms of making sure that they reduce risk and keep their organizations protected?
So I think in terms of thinking of AI, maybe invest in some training for yourself and for your security teams as well, just so you can maybe have a greater level of understanding when you're having those conversations with vendors, and you can ask them certain questions. Obviously the vendors are always trying to push something and say that they use the latest greatest AI and whatever, but just having that bit of knowledge can help you also with your security teams to understand the different use cases. They could be using AI to help automate our workload as well. What can they be doing with it? Obviously in terms of like latest threats, staying up to date with the threat landscape. They sound like quite an obvious thing, but keeping track of the latest types of campaigns. The blog, we have our threat intelligence blog where we update the kind of campaigns that we're seeing. Give you the link to that. Then back to AI again, I think thinking about what your organizational policy is on AI, because there's a lot of risks around that and how people, your users might actually be, using it, not knowing where the data is ending up. Say that, thinking, oh, this is great, this can help me, analyze all this customer data, sticking it into the model, but where is that going to end up? Where's it going to go? So I think, just circulating good governance policies, guidelines around good use of these tools.
I think that's a really good tip around making sure that your own teams are educated, because I think a lot of the time we can focus on, we need to make sure the people are educated, but actually, it's an important part to make sure actually as the people responsible for this, that we are staying ahead of threats, that we're staying ahead of potential risks, and not just, I think often I'll talk to people about kind of, in my role as a CTO and probably more practically a field CTO, that actually one of the things that I'll always talk to people about is part of my role is to try and stay, half a page ahead almost, just understand a little bit about what's coming down the road. You're trying to balance this a little bit with actual practical problems that people are having, but also that little bit of just trying to stay a little bit ahead of risk and understanding what organizations like Mimecast are doing to try and solve these problems, kind of these bigger problems longer term. So I think that's a really good tip in terms of that. So I mean, one of the things before we spoke, Kiri, one of the things that I noticed was some of the writing and actually some of the information that you guys at Mimecast are putting together and you specifically. So for people listening to us today, who are wondering about that really good point. How do I stay ahead of the threat? I mean, is there anything that you could suggest, whether it's a Mimecast thing or something you've done or elsewhere? Is there any kind of tips you can give people in terms of things they should go and look at and to try and stay ahead of the problem and understand the kind of the human problem going forward?
Yeah, sure. So Mimecast, we have Threat Intelligence Hub, which has specific campaigns we've seen, as well as our kind of quarterly report based on, what we've been seeing in the landscape. Obviously, that's a bit of a look back at what we've been seeing. We also do, it's a monthly webinar where we get different speakers. Normally it's internal Mimecast speakers. Sometimes we have guest speakers as well. We'll have people from our threat research team talking about what they're seeing. We'll talk about, what's in the news, what's coming. So we have a real variety of guests. So definitely recommend signing up for those. And I guess I always, just generally find it really useful to go to like lots of different conferences, technical conferences. That's good. So kind of staying up to date with the kind of latest developments, things that you might start to see coming down the line into technology later.
I mean, I think actually that thing about conferences is a really good tip as well. I think there's some really good, some good industry conferences anyway, but I think some really, it's a really strong space around cybersecurity. And I always tend to find, I don't know if you do the same. I mean, you're probably speaking at the most of the time, but I mean, one of the things I try and do is not just go and spend your time around the expo hall, but actually is to go and listen to some of the subject matter experts talking and sharing some of their information. Is that a good source for you? Is that something you do a lot of?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think it's a really good source. I like B-Sides conference, or but that one was definitely a great one to go to.
So, well, Kiri, I mean, it's been really useful. I think I think this kind of human threat from an IT leader's point of view is absolutely at the heart of our cybersecurity efforts, because it is going to be the thing that is likely to get targeted by a cyber attacker. And again, to pinch a phrase that Jason used actually at a presentation we gave just yesterday, that not only are it's easy to look at people and think that our people are the main threat vector, but actually they're also our first line of defense. So I think understanding kind of the problem that these guys, the problem that we face protecting our users, but also the way our users are targeted is really useful. So, I suppose before we wrap up, is there any kind of top tip that you'd kind of wrap up on and say, actually, from an IT leader's point of view, is there any kind of top tips around things that they should be going away and doing?
I think it'll, like, my top tip always is think about things from a risk perspective. Try and understand that, and I think that really helps you. And at the moment, especially, people need to really focus in and prioritize what they're working on. But just having a good understanding of what your assets are, the threat landscape. So, who might target you, why might you be targeted, and then, how would that attack play out? Based on that, what controls have I got in place already? Where are my gaps? And then once you identify, where you've got gaps that match up, but valuable assets are likely to be targeted, to have a high impact, potentially, then that's how you know where to focus your resources and efforts on.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a great tip as well. I think increasingly people in this space are understanding the importance of looking at this from a risk perspective as opposed to a security perspective. But I think it's always worth underlining, because still, I think it's easy to talk about cybersecurity and not think about risk. But to get that balance right, actually, as you just said, it's understand what's the risk, where are the gaps, and then how do we go and address the gaps, as opposed to let me just go and run out and buy the next shiny piece of technology that I can find, because ultimately, you're not necessarily. I mean, you work for a vendor, so probably you like the idea of going to buy the next shiny bit of technology. But actually, from an efficacy point of view, understanding what is it that I'm trying to fix, and then at least you can measure whether the investment has fixed a problem as well. I think if you just put in an investment and think, well, that might do something. Well, I'm not quite sure how you're supposed to measure what might do something looks like. So I think that's a great tip. So, Kiri, if people want to find out a little bit more about kind of the things that you do day to day, maybe, I don't know, want to come and track you down somewhere, is there ways they can kind of follow the work that you do?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, so just search me on there, and that's how you can find me.
Yeah, I find kind of the Mimecast blog site is quite good as well. So we'll make sure we put in terms of good for finding your writing. I think so we'll make sure we put a link in the show notes to kind of that blog site as well. So, but Kiri, this has been great. Really appreciate your insight, appreciate your time as well, and it's been very exciting doing this remotely. I feel like I'm sat at the CTO Insights news desk talking to you here. So
yeah, that's a very posh.
Thank you. Yes, it's not my desk, so we're borrowing it. But I feel a little bit like Ron Burgundy, but that's not necessarily something that's going to work for everybody. That's for people of an age. But Kiri, this has been great. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it, and thanks for joining us on CTO Insights.
Thanks, Paul. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, Kiri. So if you've enjoyed this show or you've got any comments, then please do leave them in the comments section. And if you want to make sure you catch all future episodes of CTO Insights, then do subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube, and you can also subscribe in all good homes of podcasts. But until next time, thanks for tuning in.